welcome to Security Peace of Mind with Trellix XDR. Let's go over our agenda. So first, I'd like you to meet Trellix, and we'll talk about myself and my role here at Trellix. Next, we'll talk about security operations goals, then we'll go into the common pitfalls in security operations, and then how we solve them with XDR. And lastly, we'll talk about how you can measure success. So first of all, a little bit about me. I'm Martin Holste. I'm the CTO for Cloud here at Trellix. And for the last 10 years, I've been helping build XDR here at originally Mandiant and then FireEye and now Trellix. So this has been a long journey for us. Prior to joining Trellix, I ran a security operations center for about 7 years. And that was in the public sector for a large organization. So I learned a lot there about what it takes to actually do security operations, and we've really built in a lot of the experiences like that into our product, and I'm excited to tell you all about it. So first of all, please meet Trellix. A lot of you probably don't know us. We're fairly new, but we come from things that are not so new, and we are the combined strengths of McAfee Enterprise and FireEye. And our core values, I love these. We're open, tenacious, curious, and fun. We are about living security. All right, so let's talk about the goals of security operations. What exactly are we trying to do? What is the mission for security operations? Why are we even doing this? Well, the first one is somewhat obvious. We're trying to ensure that we have full control over every IT asset that's in the business, and we're trying to prevent, detect, and remediate any security incidents. That's kind of security in general, and that's pretty obvious. The next two are a little less obvious. The second one, this is a big one, is to manage risk for the IT assets themselves and for the business processes therein. And we're also needing to prove to compliance auditors that proper procedures and tools are in place. So what does this look like? Obviously, on the prevention side, you're planning and deploying an operating security infrastructure. And this one's the one that I think we're all familiar with. So antivirus, firewalls, those kinds of things. But then it gets a little more interesting with detection. You need to plan, deploy, and operate security infrastructure to detect unauthorized activity. And these are things like IDS, IPS, SIM, and as you'll hear more about with XDR. And then remediation is where all the fun happens, building and operating playbooks and procedures for eradicating threats and recovering from those from compromised assets. This is for security orchestration and response and XDR. And you can see there's a feedback loop here. So we have a detection feedback loop, which says that remediation may add new detections, and also the prevention feedback loop that says that parts of our remediation may create new opportunities for prevention. So on the risk management, we see that the vulnerability management and threat intel actually contribute into policies. So vulnerability management is pretty clear. We're talking about software vulnerabilities, but phishing susceptibility, this is kind of a new thing that we're able to measure in a lot of places, as in, is a given user more susceptible to being phished than another? They're a little bit more risky. What about supply chain surface area? What I mean there is what kinds of libraries are included in software. Any of those supply chain attacks can be used against vulnerable libraries that maybe your coders didn't write but are implementing. And so that surface area grows, and so you have to manage that vulnerability as well. And on the threat intel side, understanding what threat actors can harm, which threat actors can harm you, and how. And so this looks like threat actor profiles, and that might take the form of behavioral indicators. So you say, okay, well, if this threat actor is attacking you, they would do this. And so if we see this in the environment, that tells us what that threat actor is. Or it could even be more along the lines of industry profiles, where you're saying, well, this type of threat actor usually goes after the industry that I'm in. So these combine together. On the top, we see the well-managed assets that can allow for less strict policies, as in the better job you do on vulnerability management allows you to maybe relax certain policies and not be fully draconian on everything. But then on the opposite side, the more threats that you have against your business means that you need to tighten those policies. So these are kinds of things that sort of work against each other and have to find some way to balance them. And the policies themselves, these are all the different things that you can configure. So user permissions, app permissions, what the hosts look like. So what this ends up looking like is saying that if we have good vulnerability management, maybe we can have a host configuration that doesn't require a screen locking every 1 minute or something like that. Maybe you can say screen locks are at 20 minutes. It all depends. And that looks at the overall vulnerability management and then the threats that are inbound. On the compliance side, this is one that's really important to think about up front as you're doing security operations. Are you going to be able to provide proof that you have actions are logged and stored for some specific amount of time, depending on what compliance regulation you're under? That hosts are well configured. Can you prove that? That users don't have too many permissions. Again, how do you prove that? Systems can be recovered by showing procedures and applications that are showing that applications are handling sensitive data correctly. So you do these through SIM and XDR. You can show how things are configured by providing host configurations themselves, by providing access to the directory itself is usually required for an audit, providing the disaster recovery plan itself, and then code audits are usually required for the applications handling sensitive data. All right, so these are the goals that we have, but what are the headwinds here? So what are the biggest challenges? So we see diverse security tools. These are different tools that require skills investment and implementation effort. And we're going to dive into these in just a second here. Looking at evolving threats, things change every single day. And so that's a big challenge because you can't just say, well, we figured out how to stop phishing, and that's the end of it. Now that doesn't handle supply chain attacks, which are fairly new. So now we have to look at a new thing. We always have to be evolving. Another issue is perennial, which is the shortage of staff. There seems to always be more work than people. And we have complex environments. So most enterprises are incredibly complicated. There's all kinds of different people, processes, hosts, everything. And so understanding all the different movements throughout the enterprise itself can be very difficult, and the security operations needs to understand all of it. And then lastly, the investigation complexity. So as you have these different modes and mixes of things in the investigation itself, it makes it more complicated and harder to do. And so how did we get here? Well, on the left here, we have the evolving threats that are changing every day and the complexity of the environment itself, just saying there's a lot of people, a lot of stuff going on. And those two things create this need for a diverse set of security tools. And between that and having a shortage of staff, suddenly you now have very complex investigations. These lead directly to that investigation complexity. So let's look at a specific example. How about operating an AI environment? You've heard a lot about AI lately. It's been in the news, been all over the place, and a big question everyone has as well, how do we do it securely? So if the business says, hey, we've got a new AI project and we built an environment for it, how does security operations handle this? Well, there's a number of things here. So number one, there's new threats from AI to make sure that it's not being misused, and that means that the AI has to be understood and handled. The flow of data for training that AI has to be understood. So this goes back to data ownership. Could be some regulations involved, but you have to understand, track, audit, secure, all of that. So that's a lot of work on top of that. And the current staff has to get training on this new tech. They need to understand what's going on there, and that's a hard thing to do. There's probably not enough time to do that. And if and when an incident occurs, the staff will need to enumerate, locate, and access multiple sources of this new data. So yes, you've stood up a new AI environment. Well, do you have the telemetry that shows what's happening in that environment? And now the staff has to learn everything there is to know about that environment. So this happens not just with AI, but anytime there's a large new project, it's not just the business that needs to understand it, it's also the security operations part of the business that needs to understand it. So what does this look like with XDR? How does XDR help with this? So XDR is a big part of navigating that complexity, and XDR stands for Extended Detection and Response. So the extension provides access and understanding the diversity of data needed. The detection analyzes that data to find the previously malicious activity, and responses, of course, are actions that contain and remediate any malicious activity detected. Okay, so what does this look like to extend our security operations on the extension side, looking at the X part of XDR? So security operations requires access to everything that's relevant to tell the complete story. So this takes the timeline of activities, as in what happened when, the assets that are linked through a series of actions. Then the context of an asset. So what is the role of that asset and what should this asset be doing? And then the situational awareness. What threats are currently relevant to the org? What would they look like if they were active in the environment? And given these threats, how vulnerable are my assets? So as a specific example, here's an oldie but a goodie. This one happens to come from Amazon. It's an EC2 instance. Is querying a domain name associated with a known command and control server. So if you are in security operations, what do you do with this? And this is a big deal because this is either an alert that it means your environment is compromised, or it's absolutely nothing. It's just a domain name that at one point somebody thought was malicious, but it isn't anymore. And so that's where we start, right? The threat intel, when was this domain declared malicious? Do we have any visibility into that? What kind of asset was this? Was it a domain name server? So that would make a little more sense why it might be passing along a query, but that does mean there's some more investigation. You don't know yet. And what did the communication look like? After that lookup, did any access happen with the IP address that it resolved to? What was the response to it? So these are the kinds of questions that immediately come up for any alert that comes through the system. And that's why Trellix has over 100 different XDR connectors available. This is just a few of them. We're actually well over 100 now. We have the most of any that I've seen. I don't know of anyone that has more connectors than we do. And this is something we've been very passionate about over the last few years as we're building in more and more connectors because we see just how important XDR it is. So I'll walk through just a few of the categories that we have so you can see what these look like. So we have the identity integrations, and these are key for flagging VIP users and being able to provide risk scores for those users. And then we have job descriptions to aid analysts during investigations and connecting users to roles that provides the basis for threat hunting. We have the business app integrations. This is where things get especially interesting with Office and Salesforce and G Suite. We even have things for TeamViewer, so you can see who's accessing systems remotely, and of course Teams and Slack. And this helps really correlate the alert and audit events. And we also get some really specific alerts out of Office environments that say exactly what users are being created from a directory perspective, and we're able to track those for anomalies, which is a big deal. We have cloud storage integrations. This is a completely separate area, just to give you an idea of the breadth that you need for XDR. So it's looking at not only the puts and the gets when you're talking about storages and things that are saved and copied and deleted from an audit perspective, but then also being able to dive in and looking at the content that's in there. And the email side has a lot to offer there as well from transaction logs. You can see if there is a phishing attack going on in the organization, who all was affected by it, and this can be very important. So being able to track not only maybe one email, but maybe a group of users got the same email or ones that are very similar to each other. And then that allows you to change policies to block threats. And of course, endpoint. So we have our own endpoint. It's awesome. But we also work with others because it's just important to have that broad perspective. So whatever endpoint you have, we probably work with it. And it's really key that you get endpoint in because you need to be able to correlate alerts from multiple hosts. And you need to be able to have that EDR trace data to collect for threat hunting, be able to contain a compromised host, obviously, and be able to provide that offline telemetry if possible. All right, let's talk about creating an event with timelines and integrations. So we talked about how XDR is able to go from all these sources and create a timeline. So what does this look like? Well, without XDR, we have these scattered events that are across various silos. So we have individual actions. So we have a user receives an email, we get that in the email transaction logs. A user logged in, okay, that's in identity logs. A user created a service account, that would be in the directory logs. A service account uploaded a file. It seems pretty weird. That's in the proxy logs. And an antivirus alert fires in the AV logs. Okay, that one's obvious. We know that there's definitely something going on if we get an AV alert, right? But the other one's not so obvious. So this is where XDR comes in because it can tie these events together to provide that context. So now with XDR, we see that a user X logged in after receiving a link in an email because we can tie those things together. Next, we see that this user X created a service account, which is unusual, and XDR tells us that this service account downloaded a suspicious file from a new domain. So it's adding this additional information at each step. And lastly, it's saying an antivirus alert fired on the file downloaded by the service account. It's not just any virus that was downloaded. It was downloaded by a service account, which means that this is a worse event. And so XDR is able to provide these risk ratings as it goes. It can say, well, at the beginning, a user that is receiving a link from an email, okay, we'll call that a risk at about 25%. Then as a user created a service account, that's unusual. Now we're at about 50%. But again, we're adding these together, right? This is additive. And the service account downloads a suspicious file from a new domain. Okay, that's getting very risky. We're already up to 75%. And when the antivirus alert hits, okay, now we're at 100%. So, okay, hang on. The antivirus caught it, right? So what do we need all the other stuff for? Didn't antivirus just do its job? Yes, but if you see this is kind of the tip of the iceberg is the way to think of it. Because yes, you were able to notice the antivirus alert, but all these other things were happening and they're actually much worse. So starting from the top, moving down, we have that rogue service account that was created. That's super bad. The compromised user account to begin with, and moreover, you're being actively targeted by a phishing campaign. So these all come together to really tell the complete story that's happening here. It's not just another antivirus alert. And so now we can see that actually with the full story, you can go all the way back to the beginning and realize that it was actually 100% risk at the very beginning because that link in the email was phishing. And it was 100% risk when that service account was created and when the file was downloaded, and of course, when the service account triggered the antivirus alert. So this entire time was actually at full 100% risk, and you only know that because you can tie all these different things together. So this is what it looks like when you are able to add these things together. For a given user, you can say instead of an event timeline, you can look at an asset, and we'll take you could be the host or user, but in this case, we'll look at a user specifically and say, okay, this user has never logged in from this device, so we'll call that plus 10% on risk. Then you can say this user has never logged in from this location, add another 10%. So now we're getting more and more risky. This user recently changed passwords. Okay, that's something we care about, and that's a very unusual thing. We're adding 35% to that. And this user is accessing apps unrelated to the user's job. And we only know that because we had their directory profile, right? So now all of a sudden we're all the way up to a risk rating on this particular user of 95%. And so you can do this for all the different users as assets in the organization and say, okay, at any given time, what is my riskiest user? And so you think back to those VIP things we showed that we're able to use in Trellix XDR by looking at things like the directory and being able to look at the user's job. Okay, so now what? We have an incident, and what about remediation? Well, this is probably the most important part because you have to do something about finding bad things happening, but it's also the hardest because now we might accidentally screw something up, right? Up until this point, it's been kind of read-only, and now we need to do something. So there's very few orgs actually take automatic actions based on detections. It's really dangerous. You have to be super good at what you're doing, and you have to have a lot of guardrails around it. It takes a long time to set up something like that, and as a result, you have this. The problem is your complexity decreases confidence. So the more complicated your environment is, the less confident you are in your overall alerting. Some actions require manual intervention, as in you can't automate them, or it's hard to, and it can put the business at risk. You can blow things up. So that's why this doesn't usually happen. XDR helps with a lot of this, though. So number one, it can provide that full context, which increases confidence. It has plugins to handle most actions, so very few things need to be manual in the end. And it can create an entire proposal to allow an operator to make that final decision. So you can have a playbook that's ready to go. It could say, here's what we recommend that you do based on what's happened thus far. And you just say yes or no. And so it saves a ton of time. And how much time does it save? That's a big question. So let's look at some metrics here, because anytime you're going to implement something significant, you want to be able to measure the progress and figure out if you're improving. So here's 4 basic ones, just food for thought. For a given asset, how many different data sources do we have connected? And I'm using these specifically because you probably haven't seen a lot of these. I don't find many that think about this in terms of, do I have enough data sources? And it turns out that that is a really key part for security operations and XDRs. I hope you've been able to see. And so once you realize that, then you say, well, we need to measure that so we can show to our management that we're making progress on this, show it to ourselves that we have what we need. So for a given asset, how many different data sources do you have connected? If it's only one or two, you probably can figure out you're not getting the whole story. And what percentage of data sources can be linked together? So this is, how useful is the data? Is it all siloed? Is it normalized? As in, is a username spelled the same way across the data? Are you able to actually connect those dots? How far can we trace an action? So we were looking earlier at that example with a phishing email that comes in and then you have lateral movement. Are you able to trace something all the way through? And you can see that those above two points here are directly related to that. And how many alerts have a threat assessment attached to them? So for an alert that comes through, do you have any idea what kind of threat would be doing that? And most start out at 0, but you can get it much higher than that to say, yeah, most of our alerts have some sort of guess at the threat actor that can at least point us in the right direction. So that's a good one to track. Okay, but let's talk about some of the really specific ones in the industry that you may have heard of. Mean time to detection. So for a given alert or incident, how fast do we have a verdict versus when the event actually happened? So an example for that stolen credential, how long ago was it stolen? So that's the mean time to detection, as in credential was stolen at 1 p.m. and we got an alert at 1:05. Okay, the alert's that's the mean time to detection of 5 minutes. And that's a good metric to track for most things. But I think the most important one is mean time to response, because it adds in not only on top of the detection, but how long did it then take to actually do the security operations activity of disabling that credential itself. And so really this is the metric that tells the whole story, because you can't have response without detection, so that's essentially included in it. All right, thank you. This has been great. I look forward to any questions that you have.